One of the things that we realize is that white matter tracts or white matter tissues within the brain are myelinated cover structures that basically are specialized tissues that carry both sensory and motor impulses from the spinal cord area all the way through the brain and basically allows the brain to interpret or be able to define what that action is, whether it's sensory or motor function. White matter tracts are different from gray matter, which basically are cell bodies. They're the neurons themselves. And that oftentimes is where certain functions and key actions would occur. When we look at the brain, we'll be defining certain connectors. What we'll find is that the brain is interconnected from one section to another. A couple of the key structures that allow for those connections would be one that links both hemispheres of the cerebrum called the corpus callosum. And we're going to break it into subsets when we get into identifying specific anatomy. And again, the corpus callosum will be one of those key connectors that connects the hemispheres of the cerebrum together. Another key connector is one called the vermis. Vermis is given the term because it had somewhat of an early appearance of a worm-like texture. That's what early anatomists described it as. In reality, specialized motor and sensory fibers encompassing both gray and white matter tracts. And this connector will link both hemispheres of the cerebellum. Structures that are really unique, that once again connect different portions of the brain to others, are generally called peduncles. Peduncles are going to link different portions of the brain to another. We'll find that there's one that's going to connect the cerebral cortex, which is a small layer of tissue that's on the cerebral hemispheres, 3 to 4 millimeters, with the midbrain. Then there's going to be others that connect the midbrain to the pons to the cerebellum at different points, and eventually the medulla to the cerebellum. So peduncles will be defining for you. There's 4 sets of those. And commissures basically are special white matter tracts that cross the midline of the cerebrum and connect different lobes and functions to different portions of the brain. All of these loosely are defined as what we call connectors. Let's give you a little bit more examples of what that entails. When we look at a mid-sagittal slice of the brain, what we find is that we have the upper portion, which is the cerebrum up here. We have the cerebellum, sometimes called the hindbrain. We have the brain stem, encompassing what we refer to as the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. But what we can't quite appreciate with a mid-level MRI slice on a T1 is that structures such as this one here is the link or connector between both hemispheres of the cerebrum. This is called the corpus callosum. We'll break this up into 4 components. Other connectors would be here, this little dot-like appearance, this little projection forward is called a cerebral peduncle. What this will do is link portions of the cerebral cortex to the midbrain itself. And then later on, we'll find some other connections as we get into a little bit more of the transverse slices of the brain. This upper area right through here is what we called earlier the vermis, and this is going to connect both hemispheres of the posterior brain or hindbrain called the cerebellum. When we look at the corpus callosum, which again links both hemispheres of the cerebellum, we break it up into 4 components. There's one small portion, which we refer to as the anterior inferior limb of the corpus callosum, that's called the rostrum. We'll see a lot of the anterior portion called the genu, and we'll see that readily on a transverse slice. The mid portion, of course, is the body, and then we'll see a lot of what's referred to as the posterior portion or the splenium. We see it on a specimen diagram as well. So the corpus callosum, we're going to define by different components of it. Again, it's going to link both hemispheres of the cerebellum. Here's a transverse slice. You have a portion of the anterior posterior horns of the ventricles, lateral ventricles. But what you see right over here is the first of one of those connectors. This is called the genu of the corpus callosum. Once again, it's going to be a band of white matter tracts that link one portion of the hemisphere of the cerebrum to another. Its counterpart back over here is the splenium, which is the posterior portion of the corpus callosum. Once again, you can readily see that connection between both of the hemispheres. On a coronal slice, you see it right over here. This would be part of the genu. Once again, giving another example how it links across the hemispheres of the cerebrum. Here on an ultrasound, we do teach a little bit about ultrasound sectional. It really won't be a mainstay of this course, but you see part of the corpus callosum on this sagittal image, this long axis. What you're able to pick up actually is the rostrum, genu, body, and splenium running posterior. Here it is on a coronal, right down the middle between the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles. Here is the vermis. The vermis is going to be, again, specialized white and gray matter tracts that are going to connect both hemispheres of the cerebellum. So we'll see this quite a bit. And this is going to give you a feeling of how the two hemispheres of the cerebellum are connected. The medulla is right here, and there's a small peduncle right over here that's going to link the medulla to the cerebellum, again emphasizing those interconnections. Ultrasound kind of on the sagittal perspective shows you the corpus callosum. Here's part of the thalamus, brainstem over here. Why they call it C, I don't know, but it refers to the vermis over here. And once again, you see those interconnections from that standpoint. Over the years, our students have learned to call this area, this collection of structures, the Mickey Mouse sign. You can see that we have the ears of Mickey, we have the head of Mickey, the little mouth of Mickey. To get more anatomical with you, though, these ears of Mickey are going to be the first of the peduncles that connect the cerebral cortex to a portion of the midbrain. So we'll be talking about those as we work our way down from the standpoint of top to bottom. Here we have superior cerebellar peduncles that link the midbrain to the cerebellum. The middle cerebellar peduncle is really not well defined, but they're going to connect the pons to the cerebellum. And then again, is what we mentioned before, the inferior cerebellar peduncles are going to connect the medulla to the cerebellum. So as we go through these structures, I'll be making reference to these different collections of connectors, and they will stand out as important landmarks for you, okay? Commissures are interesting little white matter tracts right through here. Once again, you have both hemispheres of the lower portion of the cerebrum, and right through here is a fine line. This one is referred to as the anterior commissure, and it basically is responsible for acute pain sensation. And again, those sensations can be interpreted in different portions of the cerebrum. There's another band called the posterior commissure, and it's going to help in terms of regulating eye reflex. So these are, again, two more examples of connectors from that standpoint.